I cannot believe this camera was released in 2023. Nikon just released this new beautiful ZF camera in 2023 that looks like it belongs in 1980, and I think that's a brilliant idea. Hello everyone, my name is Josh from Videos by Josh, and what is it with camera brands releasing faux vintage cameras as their new mirrorless offerings? This is crazy. Today we're talking about the new Nikon ZF camera, which was released just recently and designed to look like the company's older FM2 SLR camera from the early 80s. But make no mistake, this is a modern, fully featured, full-frame mirrorless camera with a similar sensor as Nikon's Z6 Mark II and an upgraded processor from their even bigger cameras, the Z8 and the Z9. In this video, I want to talk about this camera specifically for photo and video, as well as my general thoughts on the new style cues of making modern cameras look like vintage cameras. Nikon is not the only brand that's doing this. Now, it has been a minute since I've shot on a Nikon system, but just browsing the specs casually, it looks like they are competitive with other offerings from Canon and Sony. It's got a 24.5 megapixel sensor and Nikon's awesome 3D autofocus. It's the first full-frame camera from Nikon to have a full flippy screen and a 3.6 million dot viewfinder, which I think is incredible. And 8 stops of in-body image stabilization. That's just stupid amounts of stabilization. I'm surprised this thing isn't marketed as a gimbal. For video shooters, the camera shoots at a 4K 30 oversampled from 6K down to 4K and a 4K 60 with a 1.5 times crop. Very common in this body and price point. For video shooters, this will also be the first Nikon camera to shoot internal 10-bit N-Log, which I'm actually surprised to be saying that. Like, how has it been so long since when we've been able to use N-Log in these cameras? And over 2 hours of continuous recording. They actually cap it at 2 hours and 5 minutes. I have no idea why, but that is the cap. That's way better than the old A7 III days where I was always pressing the button after 29 minutes. I hated that. It's got some other stuff that I'm not as excited for. Like, it's got a micro HDMI port, which I think is just a bad choice. It cannot take 2 SD cards. It can only take one full-size SD card, and the other is a micro SD, so that's fine, I suppose, for redundant photo backup, but it does not work for redundant video shooting. In fact, I don't remember the last prosumer camera to have a micro SD slot. Like, is that weird? I can't think of one off the top of my head. So those are the tech specs, and they're largely similar to other competitive offerings on the market. I don't see anything too in one direction or the other. You're not making any insane compromises with this camera if you're looking for a standard hybrid offering. Let's talk about the visuals, because this camera looks incredible. I don't know what it is about me that wants specifically to shoot on a vintage camera, but this thing looks awesome. Can you believe it? Look at the top of this camera and how they've modified a standard body to fit the film aesthetic. You have a dial that's just for shutter speed. What is that about? That's crazy. I think that they actually knocked it out of the park with the visual aesthetic of this camera. It looks great. And that faux, I don't know if that's real leather or the texture that's going across the body. This is Leica looking stuff here. And I know these style cues were present in Nikon's older cameras and older cameras in general, but just to see them brought back in this professional reiteration of those styles is super interesting to me as a video shooter and as a camera enjoyer. And I can't believe this, but it actually comes in custom colors. You can get the camera in black or 6 other colors, and I didn't know I wanted this until now. I've also seen from some of the reporting on this camera that it's quite heavy and actually kind of fits the aesthetic of a film camera. It feels solid. Now that I know that Nikon's been advertising it as a magnesium alloy build and their typical type of construction, so I don't see anything crazy different other than, you know, like the leather inlays or the material grip inlays. Those are really cool. But if you look at the top of the camera, you see a little digital display that shows you your f-stop. What year are we in? It's really bizarre to see all of these old school style cues mixed with modern technology. Not that that display is modern technology, but like modern styling, and this is really weird. I don't know how to feel. I'm really torn on this camera. It looks amazing. And it's so much different than some of the other brands on the market. So the body of the camera, I'm really stoked on. I think this is a really interesting direction for Nikon to be taking, not their upper level line, like you would never see like a Z9 made in this way, or at least I don't think that's in the plans, but like this middle of the road, catch-all content creating hybrid camera, and they're leaning into the visual aesthetic. I think a lot of people are going to really like that. I think a lot of people have been lulled into thinking cameras have to look a certain way, and perhaps forgetting that, you know, in the past, they all looked really different. Like if you go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, form factor was a lot looser back then. You could get away with different looking bodies, especially in that transition to digital when everything started to be made of plastic and you got different form factors, and it was kind of like the Wild West. But this harkens back to a time where cameras were actual pieces of craftsmanship, and they were a lot quirkier, I will say that. And this camera body, I think, communicates that quite well. But it's not just Nikon making vintage cameras, obviously. When I was in the market for my Ricoh GR3 not too long ago, I did consider the Fuji X100V if I could find it in stock, which I couldn't. And that's another interchangeable lens camera that markets itself on a visual aesthetic while not necessarily sacrificing on performance quality. And if you look even briefly online, you can see that that camera is absolutely selling out and just crazy popular. And that's kind of been Fuji's thing for a long time, is selling those vintage transformed cameras. And to my knowledge, they've been doing quite well. And there are other cameras that have had more of a vintage type of aesthetic. Like I know Olympus has kind of dabbled in this. Of course, my little Ricoh has kind of a throwback style to it. But this one from Nikon, the ZF, really communicates that older design philosophy that I think they built their brand on a number of years ago. And I think it's a really unique return to form. If you're a hobbyist shooter and you just want to bring a camera on your vacation, or you're just grabbing something to throw in the bag, this is an incredible piece of kit, and I think it'd be a great decision to do that. Now, if you're a commercial photographer or videographer and you pull this out, I see nothing but intrigue on the faces of your clients, wondering why you've brought a camera from the 80s to your shoot. Like, it's just weird. But there's no denying the craftsmanship. It does look really cool. Which brings me to my next talking point, which is why I think people will gravitate towards these cameras, the cameras that are designed with this vintage aesthetic, because overall I do think it's a good idea, and I'd like to see other brands move in this direction. And I know not all camera manufacturers have the back catalog to access some of their older designs, but it could be interesting to see a brand like Sony take an interpretation on what a vintage camera could look like, knowing that they, at least for the most part, were more popular in the digital age and didn't necessarily have those roots that Nikon or Canon did. But I think a lot of people, especially in the creative space, hold their equipment in high regard. And why shouldn't they? If you're a photographer or a videographer, you're a craftsman, you're doing something creative. And, you know, speaking personally, I would want my gear to mirror that craftsmanship. I would want it to look like something to be invested in, or something that gives the appearance of quality. And just speaking off the cuff here, I think this new camera does that better than some of the current bodies that I've seen around, or at least it communicates that quality. It looks really nice. Now, of course, the looks of the camera mean almost nothing when it comes to the performance, and you could argue that some of the design cues actually would hinder your ability to take photos quickly or efficiently. I don't know. If you are one of the people that think that, then of course this camera is not for you. This camera is for a different type of photographer or camera enjoyer that wants this vintage aesthetic, this pseudo handcrafted. It's just so cool. I don't know. You can see where I fall on this. It's a cool looking camera. I think everyone wants to know that their money was well spent and they got a good value. And I think the metal accents particularly, and the build quality, or at least the perceived build quality of this camera, do communicate that to me. And it's fun. You know, obviously it evokes some retro nostalgia. Even if you weren't there shooting in the 80s, you can get a vibe for how exactly this camera was interpreted and how it was used, and it's just a really interesting body design to have in 2023. And I mean, I'm looking at one of the promotional images, and the flip out screen mixed with like the analog dials on the top, this looks weird, man. Like, I'm thrown for a loop here. I think they even have like the leather texture on the back of the screen. What world do we live in? This is bizarre. I think my final thought on the aesthetics of the camera would be that I could see someone having the opinion, and perhaps I have this opinion in certain regards, is that modern camera bodies, a lot of them lack character, or throughout their progression from one style to another, or as they improve in physical performance, they kind of lose their uniqueness. You know, like if I just talk personally about the Sony brand, like a brand that I've been shooting on for almost a decade, their A7 line has remained largely the same throughout its entire lineage. When you introduce a new camera like Nikon has with the ZF, and it's just got so much character to it, it's got tactile interactions that allow you to be more involved physically with the photos that you're taking and the creative profession that you're pursuing. Like, it's a really interesting pitch for the casual consumer to, you know, you can choose this or you can choose the Z6 Mark II, and essentially you pay the same. And it's It's not an upcharge, at least at this point. It's been a while since, as a Sony shooter, I felt jealous of Nikon shooters. I was leaning in that direction when Nikon started releasing some of their mirrorless stuff and hearing that RAW capability would be in the Z7, like stuff like that. But now I'm jealous of Nikon shooters for a completely different reason, and it's one that I never thought would be of value to me as a video shooter, and that's like the body style of their cameras. I don't know. It's a weird feeling. Oh, and I didn't even talk about the monochrome mode on this camera. So this camera, you know, it's cosplaying as a film camera. So you expect it to have some film profiles in there, similar to how Fujifilm would tackle some of their baked-in in-body profiles. It doesn't have any in-body profiles per se. It has some creative looks. I think it has 20 creative looks inside the body from stock, but it also comes with a native monochrome mode, which, I mean, if you're talking about bringing monochrome back, I think that's a really cool idea. I don't know how many people are going to use native monochrome, and looking at the specs, you can't use monochrome in video, so it is just a photo mode. But to shoot monochrome, that's such a cool thing for like a modern camera to have. And, you know, it follows the same inspiration that, like, if you're going to potentially restrict yourself subtly by changing the dials to be more analog and kind of giving up what would be the optimal digital camera layout in modern day, but you're also pairing that with the option to restrict yourself by shooting monochrome and trying to explore your creative discipline with those restrictions. I think that's a really cool, obvious move for this camera. I think it's well thought out, and I think a lot of people are really going to enjoy this new ZF from Nikon. But that's it for my thoughts on the new Nikon ZF. Yeah, me envying Nikon shooters for having this really interesting camera in their buying sites. Like, this is super cool. I'd like to see other brands tackle this vintage aesthetic, although I don't really want to see Sony go back to like the A-mount stuff. I don't know about that. But let me know what you think, if you think that more brands should be doing the vintage camera aesthetic, and what you think of this new Nikon camera. Leave a comment below, and I'll see you in the next video.